Hello and welcome to Module 9. In Module 9 we're going to talk a little bit about SOPs, or Standard Operating Procedures, training and training documentation in general, and validation. There is only going to be one lecture for this module. The module itself is only a week long, so we're going to briefly touch on these three topics, and then you will have an assignment that revolves around SOPs. We're going to talk about what an SOP is and why we have to create SOPs. We're going to discuss some of the more common data management SOPs. We'll talk a little bit about how you go about creating an SOP, how you ensure and facilitate compliance with SOPs, and why you need to facilitate compliance. We're going to talk about training, particularly documentation of training, and how you can design your SOPs to help ensure compliance. We'll briefly chat about the SOP lifecycle and validation. So why do we need SOPs? Why do we care if we have written standard operating procedures? Well, there are two reasons we care. The first is that it's a regulatory requirement. ICH E651.1 says the sponsor is responsible for implementing and maintaining quality assurance and quality control systems with written standard operating procedures. And 21 CFR Part 11 also requires written policies and procedures. So there is a regulatory requirement. But again, we always want to ask ourselves, why do we have a regulatory requirement? Well, we have a regulatory requirement because it makes good sense. When you write down standard operating procedures, you build consistency into your system. If your procedures are written down, everybody knows how to do them. They know exactly what's expected of them, and even if their tasks are separated by length or time, they can come back to the written procedure and figure out what they need to do. So I know we talked about this in the early part of the course, and I touched on it again when we were reviewing for your midterm, but I want to talk once more about the differences between standard operating procedures, department operating procedures or work instructions, and project-specific documents. And really the difference is in approval, scope, and detail. So standard operating procedures are very high level. They do not contain a lot of detail about the specific tasks or how to do the task. Instead, they focus on what needs to be done. So a standard operating procedure tends to be broad in scope, low in detail, but it has to have written approval by somebody fairly high up in your organizational structure, and you do not want to change your SOPs frequently because you have to go through an intense approval process every time you do it. Now, department operating procedures or work instructions require less exhaustive approvals. Very often the approval can be done at the department level. A manager could do it, or a subject matter expert could approve it. And so because they are easier to change, we tend to put more detail into them. So where a standard operating procedure might say something like you have to enter the data, the department operating procedure or work instruction would be more specific, and it would say you need to enter every page of the data as it is received, and you need to get the entry done within at least a 5-day time period. So the next level is a project-specific document, and that's what we've been working with in our class. We've created or used a lot of project-specific documents that explain in great detail how you perform a task. So for example, we had our data entry document that walked us through how we used REDCap to enter each form in the database. That is a project-specific document, and if you remember, it has a lot of detail in it, and typically it is not required, you don't have a lot of internal approvals for it. The person who created it might need to approve it, or a project manager might need to approve it, and the sponsor needs to approve it, but the intention is that that document can be revised easily and quickly so that it stays relevant to the project. So again, high-level standard operating procedures, mid-level work instructions, and detail project-specific documents. Proxca has a wonderful set of chapters on data management SOPs, or SOPs in general, and she has a very nice appendix, Appendix B, that outlines the more common data management standard operating procedures and gives a 1 or 2 line description of the scope of those documents. So in general, you want an SOP that covers every task that you might find yourself doing. So if you are creating a data management plan, you want an SOP that tells you how to create that plan. If you have a data management study file, you want an SOP that tells you how to maintain that study file. So really, much like the working instructions and the project-specific instructions, if you do a task, you need to have written documentation for it. What happens if you have to create an SOP? So far we've talked a lot about SOPs that we're going to assume are already in existence, that somebody else has written for us. But if you join a new company, or you are part of a company that is deploying a new technology or a new system, you might have to create standard operating procedures or participate in that creation. And when you do, you need to be thinking about content and also scope. So for content, an SOP really needs to say what your task is, who does it, when it happens, how it's done, and what proves you did it. So going back to our data entry example, you might have an SOP for data entry that tells that the data entry operator will perform the task, and that it happens as soon as the data is retrieved from the site or created at the site, and that it is done using a access control validated database, and that at the end of the data entry process you will be able to run listings to prove that the data was entered correctly. So scope we've talked about before, but I want to touch on it again. With SOPs, your scope is really at a high level. You're going to define what must occur, but you're not going to give detail about how it is done. So data entry, again, you would say all data must be entered, but you would not describe the data management system that you would use to do the entry or the project-specific policies that would be employed. Proxca has a nice little quote. She says, SOPs need to provide enough detail to ensure they are consistently carried out without providing so much detail as to end up with violations of the procedure because of normal variations in working. I think that's a great way to put it. So we're back to compliance. Compliance really just means you abide by and follow your standard operating procedure. And really what you need to know is that just having a written SOP is not enough. You have to actually follow the SOP or comply with it. And compliance requires training. People cannot comply with an SOP if they are not aware of what the SOP tells them to do. And compliance requires access. If you cannot access the SOP so that you can read it and refer to it, again, you won't know how to perform the procedures. You won't even know that you need to perform the procedures. And compliance requires documentation. And I like to think of documentation from 2 different perspectives. One, you need documentation that somebody was trained on the SOP, and also there should be documentation that the SOP was followed. So for example, if your SOP requires approval from the sponsor before you perform final coding tasks, then you would need to produce an approval form that shows that the sponsor did actually sign off. So again, you need to have training, access, and documentation. Compliance with SOPs can be hard. These documents are dry, they're very technical. Often we are human beings, we want to cut corners, and yet the whole purpose of running clinical trials is to run a well-controlled trial and be able to prove that you followed the protocol and you followed procedures ensuring the quality of the data. So we need to balance the difficulty of compliance with the need for compliance. And one good way to do that is to make sure that when you write your SOPs that they're realistic, that they are actually outlining a process that is not going to be too difficult for people to follow for everyday use. So you want your SOPs to be feasible and realistic at an appropriate level of detail. If you put too much detail in there and somebody finds that, if you say that you have to use all the red folders and one day people only have blue, you are suddenly no longer in compliance. So think about how much detail you need in your SOP and try to keep it to a minimum. Remember that you can use your work instructions and project-specific documents to add more detail. Also, I mentioned this before, you need to make sure that the SOPs themselves are easy for people to get to and to review. If they can't find the SOP, they're not going to be able to follow it. So, when you are designing your SOPs, think about making them realistic with the right level of detail and accessible. SOPs have a life cycle. SOPs tend not to be static documents. Our processes and technology in the clinical research area are changing constantly, and because of that, our SOPs need to change so that they describe the current practice. So SOPs typically go through a cycle of creation, then they are approved, individuals train on them, and then if the SOP stays static without changes, the employee will review that SOP annually. If it changes, then they will have to review the revised SOP, and the SOP itself is typically reviewed annually or every 2 years just to make certain that the procedures outlined in it are still valid and still what we do. So there's that aspect of review of the employee does to make sure they know the SOP, and then the review that a corporation does to make sure that the SOP is still valid. Training is another one of those areas where you're probably going to sense that I have a theme going. I've mentioned with several of the modules that you need to have your documentation and your training in place before a task is performed. So in other words, you don't have somebody go out and do an SAE reconciliation and then train them after. You train them before so they know how to do the job. So training needs to occur before the task is performed. In most cases, people want training to, or the expectation is that training will be repeated annually or whenever a new version of an SOP is implemented. So I actually go and read SOPs throughout the year. In fact, I'm doing a set of data management file audits this week, and I've pulled all the SOPs related to data transfers, and I'm reviewing them so I can make certain I'm familiar with the documentation that is supposed to be filed in the SOP or in the data management file to prove that we followed the SOP. So in most companies are going to have a policy that say you need to review your SOPs annually and document you reviewed them, and whenever a new version is released of the SOP, then you need to train on that new version as well. Because that's a lot of training and a lot of documentation, many companies have notification and tracking systems in place, and if they are not able to purchase an electronic system that does that for them, they might just set annual review dates and say, hey, it's SOP week, we're all going to pull out our SOPs and review them this week. So you need to have a set review cycle. You also need to document that the training on the SOPs occurred, and you can either do that through written or electronic signature, particularly if you've got a notification or tracking system that's electronic. That's the best way to go. If you're working with paper, then you can simply use a log like this SOP training log here, where you know what the SOP is, you have the SOP title, the version number, you have the date the training occurred, and you actually sign it with a little pen. So what do we train people on when it comes to SOPs and to project-specific documents and work instructions? Well, first you have to figure out who needs to be trained on what. And essentially you need to look at the role an individual performs and the tasks that they are going to be responsible for in that role. For example, if you are a clinical coder, then you need to know how to perform all of the coding activities. If you are a programmer who supports clinical coding, you need to understand the testing of the thesaurus system and the relationship that the coders have to it. So first you identify the role. Within the role you look at the tasks that role is going to be performing, and then it helps to create a matrix where you actually map out roles to tasks to SOPs. When you do that, you then can look at what SOPs are associated with the task and role, what department operating instructions or work instructions are associated with that task and role, and then what study-specific instructions that role entails as well, or needs to be aware of. For study-specific training, you really want to make sure everybody understands the protocol. They need to read it. They need to have an idea of the indication and what the purpose of the study is. They need to be familiar with the case report form. They need to have a working knowledge of the contract or scope of work document so they know what their deliverables are. And they generally, in data management, you want them to be aware of the data management plan and any project-specific instructions. So that's what people need to be trained on, and all that training has to be documented. Let's talk about validation and user testing, because these terms and concepts tend to be confused. It's important that you understand the difference between validation, verification, and end-user testing. According to the IEEE Standard Glossary of Software Engineering Terminology, it's important to understand the difference between validation, verification, and end-user or user acceptance testing. According to the IEEE Standard Glossary of Software Engineering Terminology, validation is the process of evaluating a system or component during or at the end of the development process to determine whether it satisfies the specified requirements. So validation demonstrates that the system is operational and checks that the software conforms to the requirements that were defined at the beginning of the software development lifecycle. In other words, did we build the right thing? Verification, on the other hand, is the process of evaluating a system or component to determine whether the products of that phase satisfy the conditions imposed at the start of the phase. So in other words, verification is proving that the output conforms to the input. In other words, did we build the thing right? User acceptance testing, or UAT, is the last phase of the software testing process. During UAT, actual software users test the software to make sure it can handle required tasks in real-world scenarios according to the specifications. UAT is one of the final and critical software project procedures that has to occur before newly developed software is rolled out to the market. It's also known as beta testing, application testing, or end-user testing. Now, regulations and GCP require that the software systems used in clinical trials be both validated, did we build the thing right, and verified, did we build the thing right again. So, as entry-level data managers, it is unlikely that you will be responsible for validation and verification, but you should know that it's required and understand the basic flow of the process. On the other hand, it is very likely that you will be involved in end-user testing or simple verification tasks. Data management creates and uses many products, such as databases, status reports, QC listings, and edit checks. So you need to understand the basic purpose and principles of this type of testing. So when we're talking about validation, just as when we were talking about SOPs, we need to be aware that we validate because it is required. It's a regulatory requirement. For validation, ICH E6 5.5.3 states that when you are going to be handling data electronically, you need to perform validation to make certain that your system is reliable and accurate. The FDA defines validation as establishing documented evidence which provides a high degree of assurance that a specific process will consistently produce a product meeting its predetermined specifications and quality attributes. And I have to kind of close that loop there and say, remember, we're not defining what those quality attributes are. The FDA is saying that you need to make certain that it is fit for purpose, and that can change on a project-by-project basis. So little fallback to fit for purpose for quality use. And as we discussed earlier with SOPs, we validate because it's a regulatory requirement, but we also validate because it makes good quality sense. You need to go through the validation process to ensure that your system is actually doing what you want it to do, or at the end of the trial you might find out that your data is worthless. So, regulatory requirement and common sense, but it is a lot of work. We're not going to get deep into validation. It is very complex. People specialize in it. It's probably not something that you will be involved in, at least not at an entry-level position, but it's important that you understand what validation is and how it occurs, because you will find discussions of it every time you roll out a new system or when you are talking about new technology and new projects. So every time you go to do validation, like everything else, you have to have a plan in place before you start. That could be called a validation plan or a validation protocol. Both are legitimate terms. The validation plan essentially needs to have an introduction and scope that explains what you intend to do for the validation and what you want the software to do that you're validating. You generally outline assumptions and risks. So, for example, what you're assuming the system can do and how you can support it, and the risks that you are running if the system fails. You'll talk about business requirements and functional specifications, and essentially that's what you need the software to do for you. You'll discuss the whole installation process, how it'll occur, how we'll do it, and how long it'll take. You develop a testing plan and provide a testing overview for that. You'll develop those standard operating procedures and guidelines, both for the validation and for use of the system itself. And you have to establish completion criteria. When will you know the validation is complete and the software is ready to go into production? That's what they mean by completion criteria. And then you need to talk about change control and revalidation. So you have to have a plan in place that says, if I need to make a modification of this system I just validated, how am I going to control those changes, and what am I going to do to revalidate them and make sure the system is still doing what I want it to do? Let's talk about your assignment. So please do not procrastinate. This is a one-week module. You should be able to do this assignment, relatively quickly, but if you don't work through the material and you don't get started on it on time, you're not going to be able to turn it in at time. So make sure you read PROXCA. I want you to read Chapter 15, Standard Operating Procedures, Chapter 16, Training, Chapter 23, System Validation, and then go and review Appendix B, Clinical Data Management SOPs. There's also some articles I want you to read. They're short, easy to get through. One is 10 Steps to Software Validation, and the other is Data Collection and Clinical Trials, 4 Steps for Creating an SOP. They're both nice articles. You need to read them. It's good information. I have a short video that I want you to watch called Audits and SOPs in Clinical Research. That's by Dan Safara again, and he's really talking to site coordinators, but the basic principles apply, and some of you might end up out there being site coordinators and CRAs at some point, so it's good information for that as well. Okay, what I want you to do for the assignment is go to the assignment tab, and you're going to see a template I created called SOP Table Template. It's also in the Data Management Study file. I want you to take that template and Appendix B of the Clinical Data Management SOPs. And what I want to see is that you can identify at least 4 SOPs that would be required to cover the activities we've done for this trial. So do some thinking about what we've done in REDCap or what we've done in other places. And I want you to give me a 1 or 2 sentence description of the scope of each of those SOPs. And then I want you to drop down a scope level and add some detail and come up with a department guideline or work instruction that would be created to align with that SOP or each of those SOPs, and provide a 1 or 2 sentence description of the scope of work of each of these work instructions. And finally, I want you to drop down one more level and come up with a study-specific document that could align with the SOP and the work instruction. So I'm going to show you a little example on the next slide of what that template looks like and how I want you to do the work. So the template has an example in it of an SOP, and the one I used is not related to anything we've done in the trial yet because I didn't want to take up one of the 4 that you could use. So this is an SOP, it's SOP number 001, SAE to AE reconciliation. And for scope I have reconciliation of SAE to AE data must be performed prior to database close, and it must follow the steps outlined in an SAE to AE reconciliation plan. So again, I just want 1 or 2 sentences that briefly say what an SOP with that title would cover, and you want to keep the scope pretty broad, not a lot of detail. Then I want to see that you can think about what a work instruction that aligns with that SOP would look like. So in this case, I have WI, which stands for work instruction, and don't worry about these titles. I really don't care what you put in for the titles. I simply want you to come up with something that identifies the task. But what I used was WI for work instruction 001, because that aligns with the 001 for the SOP itself. Point 1, creation of SAE to AE reconciliation plan. And here I did a little more detail of, I talk about the fact that you have to use a template, and the template has to identify the fields that will be reconciled and the level that the fields have to be reconciled down to, and that the sponsor has to approve the plan. So you can see it's a little more specific than the SOP. Next, I created a study-specific instruction title, and this one said CLR Mock 001 SAE to AE reconciliation plan. So it's specific to the CLR Mock 001 study, and it is the reconciliation plan. And in this case, I get even more specific, and I say that the reconciliation has to be performed on a quarterly basis, and I actually identify the fields that are going to be reconciled. So in the work instruction, I simply said you had to identify them, but I didn't give them. And now in the study-specific instruction, I'm going to add more detail and say all the fields. So again, I'm not worried about you getting specific titles or formats. What I want to see is you can come up with an SOP title that would relate to a task or skill or concept we've covered in the class, and that you can show me that you understand SOPs are broad, that work instructions are related but have a little more detail, and that study-specific instructions are related but have even greater detail. And 1 or 2 sentences is fine. Let me know if you have any questions.